Imagine standing on the shores of the Nile at dawn. The red sun rises over the desert horizon, and as you wait in silence, you notice something strange. The land is called Kemet, the Black Land, and yet all around you, history has tried to paint it white. What if everything we think we know about ancient Egypt is just a fragment of the truth? In museums, Egyptian statues stand with broken noses and faces that look more European than African. In our school books, pharaohs have fair skin and straight hair. Those might be the echoes of a story told by outsiders, not our ancestors. The real Egypt, our Egypt, is waiting to be uncovered beneath years of polished lies. What would it mean if we discovered that ancient Egypt was built by African hands and African souls? If the wisdom of our ancestors echoes from those temples and tombs, are you ready to see Egypt with new eyes? This isn't a legend or a myth. It's our history, and it's under siege. The story of Kemet is our story, and now is the time to reclaim it. Stay with me until the very end, and you will discover why the people of Kemet were black, why modern Egyptians are not uniformly black, and how the truth about Africa's most famous civilization has been hidden for centuries. So, sit back, because this is Africa Unveiled. Before we dive in, I know many of you are watching from around the world, united by a love for Africa. Drop a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. I'll be in the comments engaging with you. And if you're enjoying the content, a like and subscription would truly mean the world to me. All right, let's get back to the video. When most people picture Egypt, they imagine golden sands, towering pyramids, and silent deserts. But Egypt's true story begins far from the desert, deep in the forests, mountains, and lakes of inner Africa. The Nile River, the very lifeblood of Egypt, does not rise in the north. Its sources lie in Uganda, South Sudan, and Ethiopia. From there, it journeys northward through Nubia and Sudan, carrying more than water. Along its current traveled people, languages, traditions, crops, and ideas. Ancient Egypt was never an isolated civilization. It was a thriving African hub, nourished by the continent itself. The Egyptians called their land Kemet, the Black Land. This name came from the dark, fertile silt left behind each year when the Nile flooded. That rich black soil fed the people, allowing them to grow wheat, barley, flax, and papyrus. But Black Land meant more than just earth. It was also a reflection of the people themselves. The builders of pyramids and the painters of tombs had dark brown to ebony skin, tightly coiled hair, and African features. The land was black in soil and black in soul. Step into the tombs and temples of Kemet, and the walls speak clearly. Paintings show kings, queens, priests, and farmers with brown and dark brown skin, broad noses, and African hair textures. These are not European faces. These are faces that mirror the descendants of Africa today. The same sun that kissed their skin shines on us. The same earth that gave them life colors us. And Egypt was never alone. To the south lay Nubia, home to the kingdoms of Tasseti, Kerma, Kush, and later Meroe. Egypt and Nubia were sisters, sometimes rivals, often partners, always connected. They traded gold, ivory, cattle, and ideas. They intermarried. In fact, many early Egyptian dynasties had Nubian queens, and during the 25th dynasty, Nubian kings, the so-called Black Pharaohs, ruled all of Egypt. Far from being outsiders, they were Africans reclaiming their shared throne. Their art shows them proudly wearing African hairstyles and Kushite crowns. They worshipped the same gods, fought in the same wars, and honored the same ancestors. To separate Egypt from Nubia is to misunderstand them both. Daily life in Kemet also reveals its African roots. Farmers celebrated the Nile's flood the way other African communities celebrate the rains. Their gods, Isis, Osiris, Horus, Amun, were honored with music, dance, incense, and rituals that echo traditions still alive across the continent today. Linguists tell us that the language of Kemet was part of the Afro-Asiatic family, related to languages of the Horn of Africa and the Sahel. In short, Egypt's heartbeat was African. Its science, its medicine, its art, and its philosophy were born not in isolation, but within the wider embrace of the continent. To recognize Egypt as African is not just to correct history, it is to reclaim our reflection in its monuments. The story of Kemet is not distant. It is not foreign. It is ours. Every time we call Egypt the Black Land, we honor not only its fertile soil, but also the Black people who shaped its destiny. Before Rome, before Greece, there was Nubia, a kingdom of dark stone temples, tall golden crowns, and sacred rivers, a place not south of Egypt, but alongside it, in blood, in culture, and in spirit. Today, we know it as Nubia. In ancient times, it was Tasseti, the land of the bow, and later the mighty kingdom of Kush. And this was no distant cousin of Egypt. This was Kemet's southern mirror. For thousands of years, Kemet and Nubia were not simply neighbors. They were family, trading partners, religious allies, cultural twins. And at times, they were one and the same. Let's make this clear. Egypt did not civilize Nubia. It did not build Kush. In fact, some of the earliest dynasties in Egypt show Nubian influence in their very bones, through regalia, architecture, and sacred symbols. The people who built Tasseti may have laid the spiritual and political foundations for what we call Egypt's first dynasty. Both regions worshipped shared deities. Amun, revered in Thebes, was also worshipped in Nubian temples deep in today's Sudan. The lion goddess Sekhmet had parallels in Nubian warrior deities. Even their creation myths flowed from the same sacred source: water, ancestors, divine balance. These were African beliefs, adapted across regions but rooted in the same soil. When Kemet faltered, Nubia rose, not as a conqueror, but as a caretaker. During the 8th century BCE, as Egypt weakened under foreign invasions and internal strife, a powerful dynasty rose from the south. The Kushite pharaohs, rulers of the 25th dynasty, marched north, not to plunder, but to restore. Kings like Paye, Shabaka, Taharka, and Tanutamun viewed themselves as the true inheritors of Kemet's spiritual legacy. Paye's inscriptions speak of respect. He didn't just claim Egypt, he purified its temples, honored its gods, and rebuilt its traditions. Shabaka preserved ancient texts, including parts of the Memphite theology, in stone to save them from decay. These were not occupiers, they were revivers. Nubia did not steal Egypt, it saved her. Temples at Gebel Barkal, far in the south, were designed with the same sacred blueprints as Karnak or Luxor. The architecture, the priesthoods, the cosmology, all mirrored Kemet, but with a southern fire. Statues of Kushite kings show wide noses, full lips, and African hairstyles, undeniable markers of Black African identity. But how did we lose this truth? European archaeologists once claimed the Kushites were imitators of Egyptian culture, as if African people could not reflect each other without mimicry, as if two great African civilizations could not rise, speak to each other, and grow together. This was colonial arrogance. and it fueled the erasure of one of the richest partnerships in African history. Modern evidence shatters that myth. Tombs in Nubia are as ancient and complex as those in Kemet. The city of Kerma, a Nubian capital, has monuments, palaces, and burial sites older than some of Egypt's pyramids. Meroe, another Kushite city, features more pyramids than all of Egypt, with their own style, their own script, their own brilliance. This wasn't Egypt's shadow. It was Egypt's sibling. Even in art, the connection is clear. Frescoes from both regions show the same posture of reverence to ancestors, the same ritual objects, the same animal symbols. These were cultural dialogues, not copies. The Nile was not a dividing line. It was a cultural bloodstream. So when we speak of Kemet, we must also speak of Nubia. When we say Pharaoh, we must remember Kushite pharaohs. When we say Africa, we must say both names, because their stories are interwoven, like the twin strands of DNA that shape a people's soul. To know Nubia is to know Egypt. To honor Kush is to reclaim Kemet. Look closely. The walls speak. The stone keeps record. But someone else has been translating. If the last chapter listened for drumbeats and prayers, this chapter reads the faces carved into stone, the real evidence of who Kemet's people were, and shows how museums, textbooks, and the camera have often told those faces the wrong story. Walk into a museum and you see a story under glass, a pharaoh in profile, a queen in lapis lazuli, a funerary mask gleaming gold. The pieces look ancient and sacred. They are. But the way they have been displayed and described is not neutral. It carries an accent, colonial, selective, and sometimes cruel. The physical record in Kemet is clear when you know how to read it. Wall paintings show people with dark brown and deep brown skin, tightly coiled hair, broad noses, full lips, features that match populations across sub-Saharan Africa. Sculptures capture texture and style, braided wigs, shaved heads with painted patterns, ornate hairpins, crowns that sit on heads shaped like African heads. Even depictions of children and servants reveal a range of skin tones and body types. These are not stylized caricatures. They are human likenesses, with the same variety we see in African communities today. And yet, through the 19th and much of the 20th century, many Western museums and textbooks handed us a different translation. How did that happen? First, restoration and damage. Statues with broken noses and missing lips, often the result of age, weathering, or deliberate vandalism, were sometimes restored using European features. Curators and early restorers, working from Eurocentric assumptions, reconstructed faces to look more classical or European. A chipped profile became a Romanized ideal. Second, color blindness, literal and intellectual. Early archaeologists often removed traces of pigment, believing the original polychromy looked garish or crude. Stone statues were shown as smooth, pale marble. The reality, vivid paint, rich skin tones, was hidden. When color is removed, so is identity. Third, film and media. Hollywood loved Egypt. Gladiatorial sand and golden crowns fit movie screens. But casting choices and costume design reflected the image they wanted Egypt to have, a Mediterranean fantasy, not an African reality. Movies sold features to Western audiences, and those images traveled into classrooms, shaping how generations imagined Kemet. Fourth, academic biases. For too long, authorities argued that Egypt's civilization must have come from somewhere else, Greece or the Near East, because African peoples were presumed incapable of building such sophistication. That argument was not evidence-based. It was racist logic dressed as scholarship, and it shaped curricula and public perception. but bodies keep memory. They tell the truth. Look at tomb reliefs of women with braided hair, necklaces of faience beads, and skirts tied at the waist. Clothing and grooming that has clear analogs across Africa. Look at warriors and rulers from Kush and Meroe, with elongated skulls, distinct hairstyles, and an aesthetic of beauty rooted in African standards. Look at baby dolls, amulets, and household objects. The domestic life of Kemet looked in many ways like domestic life across the continent. For creators, filmmakers, writers, curators, this matters. The right image heals. The wrong image erases. When we correct museum labels and put proper pigment back into the visual narrative, we return faces to their people. On screen, this can be done clearly. Show close-ups of reliefs and statues, displaying African features, holding the shot long enough for viewers to register detail. Cut to comparisons. An Egyptian wall painting alongside contemporary African hairstyles and dress, showing continuity. Use archival footage showing how restorations altered pieces, then reveal the original through color restoration techniques. Include brief on-screen quotes from Nubian kings and Kushite inscriptions to center African voices in the narrative. Let the audience see what scholars now confirm. Kemet's material culture is African. These are African hands that hammered stone, African eyes that painted murals, African families mourning at altars. And finally, let's speak plainly. When museum narratives lie, history gets stolen. Reclaiming Kemet means asking museums to tell the full story, how objects left their places, who made them, and what they meant to living communities. It means repatriation discussions, clearer labels, and African-led curation. It means more Black voices in the rooms where translation happens. And in the next chapter, we will explore how African spirituality, across the diaspora, still carries echoes of Kemet's sacred science, from the Orishas of West Africa to the Vodun temples of the Caribbean. Listen closely. Sometimes a drumbeat travels farther than a ship. Sometimes a prayer survives a middle passage because it has roots deeper than history can cut. When we speak of Kemet, we are also listening for those drumbeats, the spiritual echoes that moved south, west, and across oceanic gulfs with people who would not forget. At the heart of Kemet's sacred life was a set of ideas that feel familiar if you grew up with African ritual, the world as a living whole, ancestors as active guardians, water as origin and passage, rites that heal and bind communities. These were not isolated doctrines locked behind temple doors. They were practices poured into daily life, offerings at household altars, purification in sacred pools, songs that called the unseen into presence. That spiritual grammar, ancestor, water, balance, spirit, is the grammar of Africa. Across West Africa, the Yoruba sing of Oshun, a mother, a healer, a river spirit who carries both fertility and fierce protection. In Dahomey and Fawn lands, the Vodun honor river deities who mediate life and death. In Central Africa, Bakongo cosmologies map a path between worlds with an axis mundi, strikingly similar to the Egyptian concept of the Nile as a cosmic artery. None of this is coincidence. These are variations on a theme. Life rises from water. The dead remain near. Ritual restores balance. Kemet's Isis, mother, magician, weaver of life and resurrection, has a familiar cadence in these traditions. Her tenderness and power mirror the feminine sacred in many African faiths. Osiris's death and rebirth story, carved on stone in the Nile Valley, finds its twin in agricultural myths across the continent. Life buried in the soil and rising again with the rains. The cosmology of cyclical time, birth, death, return, belongs to a continent that reads seasons as scripture. When millions of Africans were torn from their lands, they carried these spiritual seeds. In the Americas, those seeds found battered soil and impossibly sprouted. Under the pressures of slavery and enforced Christianity, enslaved people hid their gods in masquerade and whispered old names into the night. Out of this survival grew Vodou in Haiti, Santeria in Cuba, Candomblé in Brazil, Hoodoo in the American South. Different languages, same root system. Listen for the traces. The ritual bath, sacred in Kemet through purifications at shrines, remains sacred in Yoruba rites and Afro-Caribbean initiations. Ancestor altars, with offerings carved on tombs in Kemet, appear in the diaspora as hearth altars and family tables that kept generations whole. Rhythm and call and response, essential in temple music in Kemet, echo in the drum-led ceremonies of West Africa, and in plantation work songs that hid coded prayers. Spiritual possession and trance, where the divine enters the body to speak, to heal, to correct, appear in both Nile Valley rites and many African traditions, a living medium between worlds. These resonances do not prove that every ritual in the Americas comes directly from Kemet, but they do show continuity, spiritual concepts that move, adapt, and survive because they meet human need. Scholars of African and diaspora religions point to these continuities as evidence of a shared moral and metaphysical horizon. Beyond ritual, there is symbolic language, eyes, crowns, serpents, twins, and feathered wings that appears across African art and Kemetic iconography. The Eye of Horus, a symbol of protection and restoration, can be read alongside West African protective symbols and Pan-African motifs of regeneration, not as identical claims, but as a shared symbolic vocabulary folded into local lives. Today, across the Black Atlantic, people trace these lines back. In Brazil's Quilombos, in Cuba's Casas de Santo, in the Bata rooms of New York and Lagos, the language of Kemet is translated and sung anew. Some groups consciously reclaim Egyptian names and stories. Others keep older local names, but testify to the same spiritual architecture. Either way, the currents are clear. This is why reclaiming Kemet matters beyond museums and textbooks. It matters to ritual life, to the ways we pray, remember, and anchor ourselves in the world. When African-descended people recognize Kemet as kin, they reconnect to a living past that informs identity, healing, and resistance. It explains why, in many modern African spiritual revivals, Isis is invoked beside ancestral altars, why the logic of the Nile guides the search for balance, and why Mayat resonates as both cosmic law and social ethic. Kemet's spiritual science is not a relic. It is a toolkit. It teaches how to live with cycles, how to honor the dead, and how to balance community against chaos. In the diaspora, that toolkit kept people alive, spiritually, emotionally, and culturally, against the violence of displacement. Now that we've opened the door to the true story of Kemet, it's time to dive deeper. One of the most important, and often misunderstood, questions is this: why were the people of ancient Kemet undeniably black, yet modern Egyptians are not uniformly black today? This is not just a simple question of skin tone, but of history, migration, conquest, and cultural transformation over thousands of years. When we speak of Kemet, ancient Egypt, we speak of a civilization built by Black Africans, whose temples, tombs, and monuments reflect the people who lived, worked, and ruled along the Nile. Their skin was dark, their features African, their culture and identity rooted in the heart of the continent. And yet, If we look at modern Egyptians today, we see a population that is diverse in skin tone and features, and many are not the dark-skinned Africans we imagine from the monuments. Why is that? The answer lies in time, geography, and history. Egypt sits at a crossroads of Africa and the Middle East. Over thousands of years, its strategic location made it a bridge and a battleground for migrations, invasions, and empires. The land of Kemet did not remain isolated after the fall of its dynasties. Foreign rulers arrived: Persians, Greeks under Alexander, Romans, Arabs, Turks, and others. Each wave brought new people, new genes, and new cultures, blending with the original African population. Over centuries, this created a genetically and culturally diverse population, one that reflects both its African roots and the influence of outside peoples. Another factor is regional diversity within Egypt. Upper Egypt, closer to Nubia and Sudan, has populations with darker skin and features closer to ancient Kemet. Lower Egypt in the north, closer to the Mediterranean, historically absorbed more waves of foreign influence. This means modern Egyptians are not a single type. They are a spectrum of African, Middle Eastern, and Mediterranean ancestry. It is important to understand that this diversity does not erase Kemet's African identity. Ancient Egyptians were Black Africans, and the civilization's foundation, culture, and innovations were built by African hands. Modern Egyptian diversity is the result of millennia of movement, conquest, and mixing, not evidence that ancient Egyptians were not Black. The story of Egypt is also a story of identity and perception. Colonial narratives in the 19th and 20th centuries tried to reimagine Egypt as closer to Europe than to Africa, deliberately erasing the blackness of Kemet to fit political and racial ideologies. These false narratives still shape public perception today. So, when we say Kemet was Black, we are speaking about the people who built its temples, pyramids, and knowledge systems, about the African civilization whose culture echoes across the continent and the diaspora. When we see modern Egyptians, we are seeing the living result of thousands of years of history, migration, and interaction. A population that is African at its core, yet enriched and diversified by the currents of time. In truth, the African identity of Egypt does not vanish with changing appearances. It is preserved in the land, the Nile, the rituals, the language roots, and the cultural memory. Kemet was African, modern Egyptians are African, and the story of Egypt is inseparable from the story of Africa itself.